They underestimated your silence because they assumed it meant ignorance. That was their first mistake. They believed that unless you reacted, you weren't aware. They thought stillness was submission, that calm was confusion. But what they failed to see, what they still can't believe, is that your silence wasn't absence. It was absorption. You were listening when they whispered their schemes. You were watching when they thought the room was empty. You were studying movements, cross-referencing expressions, mapping every falsehood onto a mental blueprint they didn't know existed. You saw everything, not just the surface. You saw the source. And when they realized that, when the truth collapsed in front of their very eyes and they turned only to find you already looking back, their jaws didn't just drop, they fractured. You didn't flinch when the lies were told. You didn't correct the stories. You didn't interrupt the performance. You let them build their illusions brick by brick, watching with the kind of patient detachment only someone truly dangerous can possess. Because you knew it was all temporary. You knew that when the curtain dropped, they'd be naked, not just exposed, but historically documented. And you wouldn't need to accuse them, you'd just exist, and that alone would testify. The worst kind of shock is not when someone speaks. It's when someone's silence reveals that they already knew, and your knowing wasn't passive. It was calculated, curated, prepared for the day when the facade would crumble in slow motion under the weight of its own deceit. There's a reason they avoided your eyes when they spoke, a reason they felt suddenly cautious around you. Even when they pretended everything was fine, something in them knew. They were being seen, not glanced at. Seen. The discomfort was never yours. It was theirs. Because deep down, the human psyche can't hide from itself when faced with someone who knows. It panics. It overcompensates. It babbles to cover guilt. They thought they were controlling the narrative, but you had already memorized the script. You weren't caught off guard. They were. And when the truth finally unmasks itself, their horror wasn't about being exposed. It was about realizing you'd been watching the whole time. You didn't need to set traps. You didn't need to dig. You didn't need to pry. People expose themselves when they think you're blind. They confess in half-truths, perform innocence through over-explanation, speak with a tone that trembles under false confidence. You cataloged every shift in rhythm, every contradiction between words and energy. You were never confused. You were observing. And when they saw that, when they understood that nothing slipped past you, that their gaslighting, their games, their little whispers had all been heard, processed, and stored, that's when the terror settled in. Because now they weren't just facing consequences. They were facing memory, your memory. Precise, unflinching, They tried to manipulate the angles, bend the narrative, steer perception. But you were the wall their echoes kept bouncing off of. No matter how far they reached, they couldn't change the timeline. Because you held the footage, not video, something deeper. You carried the emotional timestamps. The eye twitches when a truth is dodged. The pauses in sentences where guilt leaks out like steam. The way their hands tensed when you walked by. You didn't need receipts. You were the receipt. And the horror they felt wasn't from being caught. It was from realizing they were never not being caught. They tried to forget, to rewrite, to bury. But memory doesn't die when it lives inside someone like you. You don't just recall events, you relive intention. You saw not only what they did, but why. You saw the hesitation that never came, the cruelty that wasn't accidental, the selfish choices that weren't circumstantial, they were preferred. And in that clarity, you never needed revenge, you only needed revelation. And when the moment came, when their world turned to face the mirror you'd been quietly polishing in your mind, it shattered. Not from violence, but from truth. The kind no one could spin, the kind only silence delivers. They called you cold, they called you distant, but the truth is, you were present, just not how they wanted you to be. You were studying behavior the way a predator studies prey, quietly, surgically, without emotion, because emotion clouds data. You don't seek vengeance because vengeance is noisy. You wait for the moment where their own actions rise to devour them. And when that moment arrives, you don't scream. You don't gloat. You simply watch them see you, not as an adversary, but as an archive. That's the fear they can't outrun. The realization that every step they took, every lie they crafted was documented in your mind with surgical clarity. And now they're left wondering, how much did you see? What else do you know? They question their own timelines. They dissect every interaction, terrified they revealed more than intended. That's your power. You didn't just witness their fall, you made them watch themselves fall. Genius isn't always in reaction. Sometimes it's in stillness, in letting the guilty hang themselves with their own rope while you document the knots. They assumed your silence was a void, but it was a vault. And when it opened, it wasn't to attack, it was to illuminate. And there's nothing more horrifying than a spotlight that exposes the soul, not the act. They wanted the benefit of the doubt. You gave them the benefit of the record. And now every sentence they utter tastes like confession. Every move they make feels like evidence, because you turned their performance into a deposition. You didn't seek justice, you became it. Not through rage, but through remembrance. And no one can fight that. No one can argue with a mind that doesn't forget, doesn't flinch, and you didn't break them, they broke themselves, because you saw everything. And now, they don't speak your name out loud, not because they hate you, but because you represent the worst truth of all, that someone was always paying attention, that the facade was never real, that every secret they thought was buried is living, inside someone who has no reason to lie, no desire to retaliate, and no fear of being called paranoid. You don't need to chase them, you just exist, and in your existence, their reality warps. Because now they know you saw it all and chose to stay silent long enough for their own guilt to scream. You didn't flinch when the lies were told because you'd already outgrown the need for validation. While they rehearsed their fiction in front of a trembling audience, you sat still, lips quiet, but mind burning with calculation. They thought your stillness was submission, that your silence meant they'd succeeded in deceiving you. But no, what they failed to grasp was that you were dissecting every syllable in real time. Their tone, their choice of words, the pauses between their fabrications. You logged it all. The flicker of their pupils, the tightening of their jaw, the unnecessary detail added to convince. These were not signs of clever deception to you, they were confessions. Clumsy, trembling confessions. And while they lied with flair, you learned with intent. You didn't flinch, because you were busy sharpening your understanding of who they truly were beneath the act. They didn't know they were performing for someone who doesn't blink at betrayal. You don't get rattled by actors when you've seen the script 1,000 times. Lies are theater, and you've walked behind enough stages to know where the props are hidden, where the truth is gagged and bound in the dressing room. They looked at you and expected an emotional reaction, perhaps a protest, maybe a demand for truth, some petty plea for clarity, but you gave them nothing. That's what haunted them. You sat like stone, and your restraint echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. Because what they really fear is not being caught, it's being understood. Not at the surface, but at the core. And when they looked into your eyes and saw no surprise, no tremble, no confusion, just knowledge, they realized the room was not theirs anymore. You were no longer a participant in their drama. You were the witness who saw every act before the curtain rose. You watched the lies bend reality, curve the air with their smoke, infect the space between you like a toxin. But instead of choking, you inhaled. You let them speak. You let them perform. You made space for their fiction because deep down, you already knew that truth has a patience lies cannot compete with. You knew that one day their web would tighten, not around your neck, but around theirs. And while they spun stories with trembling desperation, trying to buy time, trying to paint themselves as victim, hero, or savior, you sat unmoved, Your power wasn't in reacting. It was in recording. And every moment you didn't flinch was a dagger lodged into their psyche, because they couldn't handle being seen, not truly, not without their mask. And you had the audacity to see them while saying nothing. That's what broke them. They were so used to people collapsing when confronted with lies, so accustomed to panic, to begging, to emotional chaos. But you didn't give them chaos, you gave them clarity. The kind of clarity that makes liars sweat. The kind that comes not from yelling, but from seeing through. And when you didn't flinch, they realized the control they believed they held had dissolved. They weren't playing the puppet master anymore. They were standing naked in front of a judge who never asked a question. That's why they stammered. That's why they over-explained. That's why their confidence cracked mid-sentence. They were unraveling, not because you confronted them, but because you didn't need to. You saw through the whole charade before they even opened their mouths. You knew the choreography, the rhythm of deception, the empty cadence of excuses before they arrived at your doorstep. You'd seen it in others, heard it in voices that tried to mask cruelty as confusion. You learned the difference between a mistake and a pattern. And this was a pattern. Predictable, rehearsed, emotionally manipulative. You didn't flinch because you no longer saw their lies as threats. You saw them as symptoms. Evidence of the rot they tried so desperately to perfume. And now, their scent fills the room, and they can't mask it anymore. They tried to weaponize words, tried to turn empathy into a leash, tried to guide your response with half-truths and guilt-soaked narratives. But you'd been here before. You'd eaten your own heart in silence enough times to recognize what control feels like when it's trying to wear love as a disguise. You didn't raise your voice because you had already elevated your standards. You didn't chase truth from them because you already carried it within. That's what makes you dangerous. You let them feel like they'd won, just long enough for them to realize that what they thought was victory was actually exposure. That by the time they realized you knew, they were already standing on the edge of their own undoing. The ones who lie the loudest often assume they're the smartest. But you knew that intelligence isn't in manipulation, it's in perception. And your perception, it was lethal. You didn't need proof to know. Your instincts had long since evolved beyond the need for external validation. While they acted, you analyzed. While they begged for belief, you waited in silence like a storm too massive to measure. And when you finally moved, if you chose to move, it wasn't with anger. It was with truth. The kind of truth that doesn't need defense. The kind that rips through illusion like a blade through silk. You didn't flinch because you anticipated the lies. And anticipation breeds immunity. They want to know why you didn't react. They ask themselves how you kept calm, why you didn't confront, why you didn't play into their chaos. They think it's coldness, but they're wrong. It was wisdom. You knew that the liar's worst nightmare isn't being exposed. It's being ignored. And you gave them that nightmare wrapped in stillness, with a bow of indifference. You refused to give their lies the dignity of a reaction, and that's what made your silence radioactive. Because now they question everything, not just about you, but about themselves. They wonder what else you saw, what else you knew. And now the lie doesn't just live in memory, it festers in theirs. You moved on, but they haven't, because the echo of your composure haunts them in every mirror. They feel your eyes even when you're not in the room. They remember the moment you looked at them, as they lied and saw nothing move in your face. That was the moment they broke. That was the moment they knew. They didn't deceive you. They exposed themselves, and all you had to do was not flinch.